Larry and I are this. We come from a very much more philosophy of science perspective than, well, not than Rosa, but than some people who are here are talking about LLMs. And this talk is really methodological, and the thesis is sort of methodological, which is there should be no special pleading on behalf of LLMs or against LLMs either. Um, that when we're looking to assess the cognitive capacities of LLMs, we should be evaluating them just as we would look to evaluate the cognitive capacities of any other creature or system that we might encounter. And Larry and I are going to say that current LLMs fall short of being cognizers, and we're going to give you two kinds of reasons to think so. One is that they're disembodied, and the other is that they're, as Dennett introduced into our vocabulary, they're sphexish. Um, we could be wrong about that and still right about the main purpose, which is the methodological injunction. And then we're going to point out some hazards to the whole project of trying to do this kind of evaluation. Um, and in particular, that we're concerned that a lot of discussion of LLMs is focused on benchmarks, and that benchmark thinking is appropriate for engineering, but not necessarily appropriate for explanatory context. And so if we want to know how to really understand and explain what LLMs are doing, and whether it's right to think of them and explain their activity in terms of cognition and psychological phenomena, we have to just keep doing the hard work of the psychological and cognitive sciences, and there's not a shortcut by way of benchmarks or litmus tests. So that's where we're headed. And we come at this from a context of probably too much time spent thinking about the phenomenon of multiple realizability in sciences, and particularly in the cognitive and brain sciences. Um, and worrying about these questions about when we should think that systems are similar or different from one another cognitively, neurologically, and so forth. So we have some pictures here from the Jetsons on the slides as we go through, partly just to keep you entertained if you don't care about our thesis or what we're saying, but also because, you know, here we have the Jetsons and we have people who are thinking, but then we have a talking dog. The dog's able to talk with the assistance of the collar that allows him to vocalize. We have two different kinds of aliens, and then we have the intelligent robot maid, who's also the comedy foil. Oh, looks like our a loose connection over here, so hopefully it won't happen too many times. Um, all right, so if you don't know about the Jetsons, then it was a cartoon series that ran from 1962 to 1963. If you do know about the Jetsons, you're probably surprised that it only ran from 1962 to 1963, because the pop culture impact of the Jetsons was much bigger than a one season TV run. And I think it's not trivial that a lot of early discussion, I mean, it came around while there was lots of early discussion of artificial intelligence and around the time that some of the formative work in philosophy was done. So it was in the late 60s that Hilary Putnam articulated this famous argument against the identification of minds and brains, or mental states and brain states, by way of, um, no, that's fine. Let's just try this. I think it's the connector rather than anything else. Based on the idea that mental states could be implemented or realized in any of a variety of systems. And he famously says at one point, it could be anything. It could be copper, soul, or cheese. Of course, we're really not concerned about souls and cheese, well, about copper and cheese, but more about brains and silicon-based systems and so forth. And of course, those particular silicon-based systems we're interested in here are the LLM style ones. So the phenomenon of multiple realization, the idea that physically different kinds of things could be realizers, implementers of cognitive and psychological states or processes. We're indifferent to whether we talk about states or processes or events or whatever. Was by Putnam mainly meant to, as a critique of the idea that mental states are brain states, that you have to have brains or brains like ours, right, in order to be psychological or cognitive systems. But remember, he was also, not by the same argument, but he also was criticizing behaviorist views where the relevant inputs and outputs were not neural inputs and outputs to the brain, but were whole bodily inputs and outputs, stimulus and responses. And his proposal, you're probably all familiar, is this functionalist hypothesis that having psychological states or implementing or realizing psychological states involves both interactions with the world and internal connections between the states of the system, which of course that's part of what Rosa was focusing on earlier. So the multiple realization argument is supposed to be a reason for adopting the functionalist hypothesis, or the functionalist hypothesis is meant to be a proposal for what minds could be if they're not brain states or brain processes or only behavioral states or processes, right? It's the in-between. And once you have this idea, it seems obvious that, of course, it could be robots or computer systems or whatever sorts of things that could have that, copper, silver, cheese. Okay, so this all familiar to you, hopefully, or relatively familiar. That's the general idea. Larry's going to come on now, talk about how we think about multiple realization and approach those questions, and then start to talk about some concerns we have, and then we'll hand back off the other way around. So here we go. Whatever you prefer.
Well, I'm the other half of this team. And it occurred to me, I'm planning to retire at the end of May, so this could be the last talk I ever give, which I don't know if I want to end this way, but it's what's going to happen. Okay. So I started talking about corkscrews in this 2000 paper, and the idea was to try to figure out what sort of conditions need to be met for different corkscrews to count as different realizations of the kind corkscrew. Whoops, how do I go backwards, Tom? Little one. Okay. So here on the left we have two different designs of corkscrews. The waiter's corkscrew on the left, and then the P2 and P3 are realizations of corkscrews, but they're the sort of double lever corkscrew. And then on the right we have different kinds of waiter's corkscrews, and what I was asking was, which of these count as different kinds of realizers? And the question was of interest, of course, because of the way that the multiple realization argument was used as a form of anti-reductionism, the idea being that higher level kinds or psychological kinds, if multiply realized, can't be reduced to, say, brain states, because if the higher level kind is multiply realizable, there's possible that there are non-brain states realizing the psychological kind. But so my argument then was that there are some differences that matter. Come on, Tom. There are some differences that matter among the realizers, and some that don't. And it seemed to me that the difference between the waiters and the double lever corkscrews was a difference that mattered because the sort of causal properties involved or implemented in these different devices were different. The waiter's corkscrew is a simple lever. The double lever corkscrew uses a rack and two pinions. Whereas, although there are physical differences between those three waiter's corkscrews on the right, the differences, the physical differences, are differences that don't matter to how these things cause cork removal. Sorry about this. I don't know why I'm saying I'm sorry. It's not my fault. I'm generally sorry that it's happening. That's what I mean. Okay, so how do we capture this idea that some differences matter to whether the realizations differ and other differences do not matter? Well, those sorts of questions brought other sorts of questions, and Tom and I started working together on this project. The first part of the project, we're concerned with how we should evaluate the claims about sameness and difference that underlie claims about multiple realizability. And the second part of the project, which I'll be talking about, or one of us will be talking about in a few minutes, is what is the evidence that particular examples of psychological states are either actually multiply realized or possibly multiply realizable. And the kind of recipe we came up with for identifying genuine cases of multiple realizability and distinguishing them from apparent but non-genuine cases involved this four-part recipe where the first condition is that the A's and B's are of the same kind and model or taxonomic system S1. So we have psychological states, that's our system S1, the waiter's corkscrew and the double lever corkscrew are the same kind according to some model, but they're different kinds according to some other taxonomic system. So on the one hand, the two different kinds of corkscrews are the same, they're corkscrews, and on the other hand, one uses a lever, one uses a rack and two pinions, and so they're different. And conditions 3 and 4 are designed to tell us sort of what kinds of differences we should be concerned with between the different kinds, the different physical realizers. Let me run you through an example to illustrate the sort of thinking that was involved here. The thinking, of course, requires a look at the sciences involved that tell us about these realizers and the kind that they realize. Whether we have two realizers that are the same or different with regard to some taxonomic scheme comes down to whether the same different explanatory model is applied to those different kinds of realizers. So here's a case that that we took to be common as an example of multiple realization. You see lots of people talking about neuroplasticity as just an obvious case of multiple realization. It looks like a psychological faculty that is realized in one part of the brain might become realized in a different part of the brain, and neuroplasticity is therefore taken as evidence, common sort of evidence for multiple realization. And that's not a good enough, that sort of suspicion or claim requires further justification. We can grant that there's neuroplasticity, but deny that neuroplasticity is a case of multiple realization, and we do so by relying on the kinds of factors that we specify in our conditions. So there's a neuroscientist at MIT, I believe, whose last name is Sir Meringue. Yeah, Sir. Okay, good. And what he did was he took some ferrets and baby ferrets and rewired them so that input that would normally go to their visual cortex would go to their auditory cortex instead. And his question was whether when you rewire these ferrets so that they're now computing visual information using their auditory cortex, what happens? Do they see? And it turns out that, yeah, they do see. And so the kind of tempting conclusion is that we have a case of multiple realization, because here's a ferret doing some psychological processing that ordinarily would have been done in its visual cortex. Now it's being done in its auditory cortex. What could be more obvious than that's an instance of vision being multiply realized? But when you actually look at what's happening in auditory cortex, it seems like, to the extent that the rewired ferret is able to see, and they don't see as well as a normal ferret, but to the extent that they're able to see, the auditory cortex has reorganized itself in such a way that it resembles visual cortex. So it develops columns of orientation cells. It develops a kind of spatial map. And so what Tom and I claim is that turns out that neuroplasticity isn't obviously, as typically thought, an illustration of multiple realization, because to the extent that the ferret is able to see with its auditory cortex is now organized like a visual cortex. And to the extent that the auditory cortex does not resemble the visual cortex, the rewired ferret's vision is impoverished relative to the normally endowed ferret. So the conditions that we developed are able to sort of render that verdict, which we think is obviously the correct verdict. You don't get multiple realization just as a consequence of neuroplasticity. So in topic A there, the question in A, that sort of required philosophical analysis to decide what's important in the evaluation of claims about multiple realization. But it's up to the science then to tell us about the evidence that favors or disfavors actual cases of multiple realizability. Looking to evidence might seem obvious, but many philosophers who've discussed multiple realization think that you don't even need evidence for multiple realization. It's a priori true, or if not a priori true, it's demonstrated by watching a movie, which I guess is a kind of evidence. So here's Richard Fumerton. It's hardly the case that the philosopher needed to wait on empirical research to settle the relevant philosophical issues. We would have to be stupid not to realize that it might turn out that creatures with interestingly different kinds of brains could still have the same mental states that we have. We didn't need to consult cognitive scientists to reflect on the relevant modal question. All we needed to do was watch enough episodes of Star Trek to realize that we'd better understand mental states in such a way that it's at least possible for the same mental state to have a radically different physical base. So why should we believe in multiple realization? What's the justification? Star Trek. And we can run the same argument appealing to Disney movies to demonstrate the possibility of multiple realization. And if you think of multiple realization as an empirical thesis, which is how Putnam introduced it to us, this ought to strike you as maybe ludicrous or something close to ludicrous. Certainly, Ned Block and Jerry Fodor thought that we needed empirical evidence in order to establish the multiple realizability thesis. After all, if you didn't need empirical evidence, and if multiple realizability was supposed to be a challenge to reductionism, then reductionism would be a kind of a priori truth, which it shouldn't be. So among the sorts of bits of evidence that Block and Fodor thought we should look for was the conceptual possibility of machines. They say they want empirical evidence, but then they talk about a conceptual possibility. So I'm not really sure about the wisdom of that strategy. But they talk about the conceptual possibility of machines psychologically similar to organisms, but physiologically sufficiently different from the organism that the psychophysical correlation does not hold for the machine. And this is now supposed to be true of LLMs, or is it true of LLMs? Do LLMs demonstrate the actuality of machines psychologically similar to organisms, but relevantly different physically? Are LLMs a different realization of minds than the human way of realizing minds? We're going to now consider some arguments against the idea that LLMs realize what I'll be calling intelligence or cognition. And there are two problems that Tom and I think challenge the idea that LLMs are indeed cognitive. I'll talk about disembodiment and then hand the mic back over to Tom. I don't know how to pronounce that word, so that's how we divided the labor here. So I want to talk about some lessons from embodied cognition. I understand that embodied cognition is a controversial field. It's not clear all the time what its research commitments are. There's lots of different interpretations of what's going on in the embodied cognition research. But I think we can sort of put aside some of the stickier issues and accept some general lessons that might hold even if we don't agree with all the planks of the embodied cognition platform. Yeah, this is my last talk, and look what's happening. Well, because I haven't accepted any other invitations to give talks this year.
If you want it to be.
That's one for my therapist and me.
I don't know, I was not the. Yep. Well, what I'll do is email it to everyone. Yeah, it's in Apple Keynote. Oh, it's already been exported as a PDF. Which is a PDF print. Oh, okay.
There is a tech person. I'll just try to get through this really quickly. Okay, so that was too fast for me. working again. So try to remember what I've said so far. Okay. Well, we're switching iPads, so we might have better luck. Okay. All right. Well, let's see what I can do with this. So some of the lessons from embodied cognition involve the importance of embodiment because it's with our bodies that we interact with the world in intelligence generating ways. This idea was made prominent by Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers in their discussions of extended mind. And it also seems that our conceptions of the world, and I don't want to try to define conceptions. I hope what I say is sort of sense enough of what I mean here. Our conceptions of the world are shaped by our bodily properties. And I think when we reflect on these 2 points, they provide premises in an argument against the possibility of LLMs having human-like intelligence. So the argument is sort of in the spirit of what we've heard already today. We've heard Daniel talking about a failure of LLMs to be considering or having the right kind of evidence for the beliefs that they have, and for that reason, failing a condition of that we think is required for intelligence. And then we heard Rosa talking about the requirement of care or concern as another reason to be dubious of LLM's capacity for intelligence. And I'm going to focus on embodiment considerations to form a similar kind of argument. Tom, we didn't connect this, so you want to just run the slides? Okay, so work in extended cognition motivates the idea that the brain is only part of the locus of intelligence. So from the perspective of extended cognition, the brain's job is in part to organize or exploit the environment in ways that minimize its processing load. So the thought from people like Andy Clark is that it's wrong to characterize the brain as the central locus of intelligence, because actually what the brain's job involves is not mentation as such, but an organization of the environment around it in order to create mentation. So human intelligence emerges from the interactions between brain processes and environmental features. So some of the sort of classic investigations of this idea, the psychologist Dana Ballard and colleagues found that when subjects are asked to do some sort of task like recreate a model, where's my dot? Oh, I don't have. Shouldn't this laser pointer work? Doesn't matter. When subjects are asked to recreate a model on a workspace using resources, there are different strategies the subject might use, but the strategy the subject ends up using is, rather than simply sort of memorizing the color and location of these blocks in the model and then drawing from the resource space in order to recreate it in their workspace, what they do is continually saccade from the model to the resource to the workspace, identifying first the color of a block and then a location of the block. So they're relying on the environment to reduce the processing load that the subject would otherwise have to endure if they didn't have the model in front of them from which to draw information. And Andy talks about this feedback loop that we're all familiar with. We're sitting in front of our monitors trying to say something interesting, and we produce sentences. We look at those sentences. Reading the sentences gives us ideas for further sentences or for revisions of the original sentences. And Andy's idea is that it's not as if, we're all David Lewis and prose springs from our mouths, lucid and perfect. Rather what happens is that we're engaged in this kind of loop in which the environment is a critical part. And the idea of conceptualization comes from work. Probably Larry Barsalou was the first to develop this idea with a lot of care. And what Barsalou was interested in was trying to understand how people form ideas about the things in their worlds, in the world. And what he found was that subjects, when thinking about objects in the world, will reactivate those parts of the sensory motor system that had been triggered on the initial encounter with these objects in the world. And Barsalou's claim is that when thinking about an object, we're able to think about this object because of the reactivation of these perceptual sensory motor areas of our brain that were activated on original encounter. And so our conceptual thinking, our thinking about objects in the world, is somehow imprinted with the sorts of properties of the human sensory motor system. So the idea is when we think of, say, a hammer, the thought involves reactivation of the sensory motor processes initially triggered in our interaction with hammers. So how a human conceptualizes a hammer then would differ from how differently embodied or disembodied minds would conceptualize a hammer. So when we're thinking about a hammer, there's activity going on in our motor regions of our brain, namely the regions of our brain that control our motions, typical of hammer use. And there's activity in auditory cortex of the sort that occurs when you hear a hammer striking a nail. And there's activity in our visual cortex of the sort that occurs when actually looking at a hammer. So imagine a differently embodied organism. They would have sort of different areas of their brain active when encountering a hammer. And so the way they think about hammers would differ from the way that human beings do. So I want to take these ideas of extended cognition and embodied cognition and turn them into a weak argument against the possibility of LLMs having human-like intelligence, and then a stronger argument. The weak argument is just this. Extended cognition tells us that human-like intelligence emerges from interaction with the environment. The embodied cognition thesis tells us that human-like intelligence carries the imprint of sensory motor activity of a human-like body. And LLMs don't do either. They don't interact with the environment, and they don't possess a human-like body. So LLMs would not possess anything like human-like intelligence. That's the weak argument. There is a stronger argument. For all we know, intelligence always emerges from interaction with the environment. And for all we know, intelligence will always reflect properties of the sensory motor activity of a body. And LLMs do neither of those. And so let's see if I can remember the conclusion. Oh yeah, they don't have human-like intelligence. Okay. Yeah. Now I'm going to let Tom deal with it.
So the second part here is the concern. So one thing, by the way, this is LLM generated, and you can see that it's actually got the folds going completely in the wrong direction laterally rather than coronally. I can show you what happened when I asked it to make an anatomically correct brain in that. It was much scarier. It had a face, and so I'm going to see if the clicker will work. So one kind of consideration is that at least current LLMs aren't connected to the world in the ways that embodied and extended cognition research suggest that intelligence generating or cognitive activities are for us, at least right now, right? Another concern is this idea that Dennett called sphexischness. So probably many of you are familiar with the Dennett Sphex story. The Sphex wasp is a burrowing wasp, and it digs a burrow and it captures a prey, which it drags to near the periphery of the burrow. It then goes into the burrow to check that nothing has come into the burrow, goes back out, gets the prey, drags it in, lays its eggs so that there's food for them to feed on when they hatch, and etc. And the problem is that if the prey is moved, the paralyzed prey is moved while the Sphex wasp is going in and checking the burrow, then the wasp goes through this whole routine again. So the idea is this animal seems to be doing this very creative, intelligent, rational thing. It has many steps, and we can understand each step and why it's conducted. But if the routine is disrupted, it gets completely reset and the animal just does the same thing again. Now, as it turns out, it's not true that the Sphex wasp does this. So as is sometimes the case, Dennett exaggerated the evidence. Nevertheless, the general point that when we have, so even if this, paradoxically, even if the Sphex wasp isn't actually Sphexish, we can understand that if there were creatures that were Sphexish, that whose sophisticated behaviors were completely routinized, that we expect more out of cognitive systems than that. We expect some kind of generality in their behavior. We expect some kind of flexibility in their behavior. So discovering that an animal's complicated behavior is sphexish, or a system's complicated behavior is sphexish, in the sense of routinized like this, can be a defeater for the hypothesis that what it's doing is a cognitive or intelligent behavior, right? So when I point out to you that my open art brain in the vat is actually not a good brain, but is an artistic rendition, we start wondering if the open art understood the instruction to make an anatomically correct brain. I also tried to make a bunch of octopuses in the style of the Jetsons, and they all had 4 eyes. They had cartoon eyes and real octopus eyes, right? Eyes where the octopus eyes would be and octopus where the cartoon eyes would be. So, you know, these are the kinds of foibles, right, that reveal to us that, at least in their current instances, our LLMs are, you know, sometimes reveal themselves to be doing simply routinized things of the sort that when we discover them about other systems, make us doubt that those systems are acting in intelligent or cognitive ways. So what this points at for us is when we're looking at any kind of system, the Sphex wasp or anything else, and asking, you know, is this a cognitive behavior? Does the thing have this, implement a certain cognitive process? It's not usually going to be this piecemeal thing where we're looking at one sort of thing it does or another, but rather we're asking, like, should we apply the explanatory model of psychology to this thing? And the explanatory model of psychology includes a variety of kinds of behaviors and capacities and activities, not just one specialized one or a small number of specialized ones. And they're typically flexible and connected to one another, right? Some of this came up in earlier discussion today already, right? So a capacity to produce speech or images or musical compositions or so forth. Each of those on its own is incredibly impressive, right? Whether, even if we don't think they're produced, cognitively or not, I mean, what they do is very useful, right? But, the question of whether in total, and somebody mentioned the holistic aspect of thinking about cognition earlier. The question we're asking is, in total, should we take the explanatory models of psychology and apply them to the system? And we think right now, considerations like sphexitionist, disembodiment, lack of connection with the extension, suggest that the answer is currently no. Right? That currently, no, they're not the kinds of things that we're prepared to say the best total explanatory model that we should use is the explanatory model of psychology that we use when we talk about cognitive creatures. Okay? So that's the negative part. I guess they're all negative parts in a certain sense, but even if we're wrong in that particular assessment, I imagine we're about to get to discuss some of that. The emphasis is on that the project that we, when we're asking the question, what are the cognitive capacities of LLMs? Are the capacities of LLMs similar to the capacities of humans or other cognizers in the relevant ways that would enable us to, call them cognitive, right? To use those predicates. What we're asking, we think, is does the overall explanatory model of psychology apply to these things, or the psychological sciences? Now, this is the empirical functionalist, if you like, right? Does the empirical psychological theory apply? And this is no easy project, right? And this is why we're wary of shortcuts. So, for example, one problem that we can easily imagine arising, not easily imagine, we know it will arise because it already came up in the embodied and extended literature is, okay, well, what are the cognitive capacities and abilities? What are the boundaries of those? Which parts of psychology are the ones that are more essential or more central, and which are more peripheral, right? So classic example is things like one of the central features of human memory with which we are all familiar is that it decays. We forget things, right? But that, is that a really important feature of memory? If you have a system whose memory doesn't decay, do we say, well, that's not memory, the model doesn't apply? Well, most of us would say, like, that's good memory, that's better memory, right? That the decaying of memory is not a crucial bit of the psychological theory. But again, that itself is just tied up in the holistic theorizing of cognition, in the sciences of cognition and psychology. So, awesome. So, we know we're going to face, all of us who theorize about these things, are going to face these questions about, if you say, look to the sciences, we're going to have to expect that they're going to help us answer these questions about what are the central pieces and what are the not central pieces. And those are going to be hard fought, right? And it's not just going to be philosophers refereeing, right? It's going to be in the trenches of the sciences of trying to understand, what are the, are we going to exclude the plant cognizers, or are we not going to exclude the plant cognizers when we theorize about these things? And secondly, so this is a question about the scope of psychology, right? What falls within the sciences of psychology and of cognition? And secondly, relatedly, maybe it's just two sides of the same coin. The project then is not one of meeting or locating benchmarks. Okay, benchmarks are super important for building systems, right? For engineering systems, we want them to do certain things for us, right? For their applications. The Turing test, of course, it's a benchmark, right? It's a litmus test of that sort. Can we, would a system that does this, is the Turing test a suitable replacement for the question, can machines think, right? In the way that Turing himself proposed. Scientific thinking is not just a matter of adding up benchmarks in that way. It's not to say that benchmarks or tests are not ever involved, right? But typically what we're involved in is a more holistic enterprise of trying to produce models and find out whether those models have an overall fit with the phenomenon or with the system. And so, I mean, I was at a talk recently, somebody from one of the Google DeepMind projects, and they were talking about the benchmark they were fixated on was generalizing from small numbers of examples. Right. So they were saying, look, this is a hallmark of intelligent behavior is that intelligent behaviors like humans can generalize from a small number of examples. How can the system do that? They do the implement chain of thought reasoning to improve the performance on generalizing from a small number of examples. Awesome. Now we've reached that, right? But yes, it's true that that's one of the things that cognizers do, but it's not at all clear that that benchmark is importantly attached to the overall application of a psychological model to a creature. So we know that punting, as it were, to the empirical scientists, sounds like a cheap way out, but it's actually an expensive way out. It means we're all going to have to really take our time and see what the sciences tell us about these various features. So, we're skeptical that current LLMs are such that the total psychological models that we have, or the best psychological theories available to us, apply to them. We think that there's some risk that we'll get thrown off, especially by benchmark-oriented thinking that distracts us from a different kind of thinking that's involved in explanatory sciences and scientific modeling. But most importantly, we want to not get distracted by the really impressive things that LLMs do, and no doubt that they'll do even more incredibly in the next couple of years, and think that that's a shortcut to the conclusion that they're cognizers. The question of whether they're cognizers is the question of whether our overall cognitive and psychological theories apply to them, and that's a hard one. So thank you.